One time, as we're driving up the old scenic highway, my father said, "I know how to kill someone and get away with it." Being 13, it was over my head.
A body surfaces in the Mississippi River on December 12, 1997. 21 years old, star athlete, last seen leaving a bar. The police call it an accident. 3 months later, another river, another body, another college athlete, then another and another. Over 40 young men, all found in water, all ruled accidents. But here's what the police reports won't tell you. At nearly every recovery site, investigators found the same thing: a smiley face, painted in spray paint. Always watching, always grinning. 2 retired New York Police Department detectives spent 15 years connecting these cases. They say it's murder. The Federal Bureau of Investigation says they're wrong. 40 families are caught in between, desperate to know one thing. Did their sons accidentally drown after a night of drinking? Or were they hunted by something far more sinister? This is the story of the most controversial serial killer theory in American history. A theory that asks one terrifying question: what if the deadliest killers in America have been hiding in plain sight for 25 years? What if they've never been caught because nobody believed they existed? But before we can understand the pattern, we need to meet the first young man who made 2 detectives question everything they thought they knew about unnatural death. Patrick McNeil was everything a parent dreams their child will become. 21 years old, Fordham University, pre-law, smart, popular. The kind of young man who texts his mother goodnight even when he's out with friends. On February 12, 2002, Patrick went to a bar in Manhattan with friends. Security footage shows him leaving alone at 2:47 in the morning. He was never seen alive again. Patrick's mother would later say they told her he fell in the river, that he was intoxicated and he fell. But Patrick knew those streets. He'd walked them 100 times. Something about the explanation didn't sit right with her. Something felt wrong. 8 weeks later, Patrick's body was found in the East River. The autopsy concluded drowning. Blood alcohol level, 0.18, case closed. File it away. Move on to the next tragedy. Except one detective couldn't let it go. Kevin Gannon, 40 years with the New York Police Department, homicide specialist, the kind of investigator who sees patterns where others see coincidence. Something about Patrick's case felt wrong to him too. Detective Gannon would later recall that he'd seen accidental drownings before. This wasn't adding up. Where Patrick went in, where he surfaced, the currents didn't match. The timeline didn't match. The condition of the body didn't match what you'd expect from someone who'd been in frigid water for 8 weeks. So Gannon started digging into other cases, cold cases, closed cases, files gathering dust in police archives across multiple states. What he found would consume the next 15 years of his life. And what he discovered next would make him question every drowning case he'd ever closed. Christopher Jenkins, University of Minnesota, lacrosse player, the kind of athlete who could run 5 miles without breaking a sweat. Halloween night, 2002, just months after Patrick McNeil. Chris left a bar in Minneapolis. Vanished into the night. 4 months later, his body surfaced in the Mississippi River. Here's where it gets disturbing. The medical examiner said Chris had been deceased less than 2 weeks, but he'd been missing for 4 months, 106 days. Where was Christopher Jenkins's body for 106 days? The autopsy showed drowning, high blood alcohol content. Everything pointed to an accident. Another tragic case of a young man who had too much to drink and ended up in the water. But Gannon noticed something else, something the local police had overlooked. The condition of the body. It wasn't consistent with being in cold river water for months. The decomposition pattern was wrong. The tissue degradation didn't match the timeline. And then there was the graffiti. 200 yards from where Chris's body was recovered, someone had spray painted a smiley face. Bright yellow, crude, simple, just a circle with 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a smile. Gannon filed it away as a coincidence. Urban graffiti is everywhere. Kids spray painting walls. Nothing unusual about it. Then came Todd Geeb, Michigan State, 22 years old. June 2005. Left a party near a lake. disappeared into the darkness. His family organized search parties. Volunteers combed the shoreline. Divers searched the water. Nothing. 28 days later, a fisherman spotted Todd's body floating near the shore. And there it was again, a smiley face. This time on a tree overlooking the water. Fresh paint, recently applied. Gannon partnered with another retired detective, Anthony Duarte. Together, they started mapping every case that fit the profile. College-aged men. Athletic, last seen near bars or parties, found in water. High blood alcohol levels. The map they created would span 11 states. 45 cases over 12 years. Every single one ruled an accident by local authorities. Every single family told their son made a tragic mistake. And at 40 of those sites, smiley face graffiti, different styles, different colors, different locations, but always the same basic symbol, always near where the bodies were recovered. But the graffiti was just the beginning. When Gannon and Duarte looked closer at the victims themselves, they found something that made their blood run cold. Let's talk about randomness for a second, because that's what the police said this was. Random tragedies. Intoxicated college kids making bad decisions on cold nights near water. But here's the thing about randomness. It doesn't follow a pattern. It doesn't select specific types of people. It doesn't cluster in specific locations at specific times of year. And these deaths, they followed a very specific pattern. Victim profile, white males, ages 19 to 25, athletic build, above average height, usually over 6 feet tall, popular with their peers, high-achieving students, bright futures ahead of them, the kind of young men who had everything to live for. They were all last seen in cities with major waterways, rivers, lakes, canals. They all disappeared between November and April, the coldest months of the year when hypothermia can set in within minutes. They were all found in water within a 50-mile radius of where they vanished. And here's the detail that haunts the families the most. Not one of these men had defensive wounds. Not one showed signs of fighting back. Not one apparently called for help or tried to escape. No torn clothing, no bruising consistent with a struggle, no tissue under their fingernails from clawing at an attacker. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht would later observe that in a typical drowning, especially when alcohol is involved, we see signs of struggle, bruising on the arms from trying to pull yourself out, torn clothing from grabbing at rocks or branches, water in the lungs from gasping and panicking. These cases, textbook drownings with one problem, they're too perfect, too clean, too consistent, too perfect. Think about what that means. If you fall into freezing water while intoxicated, your body goes into shock. You panic, you fight, you scream, you thrash. Every survival instinct kicks in. Even if you're drunk, even if you're disoriented, you fight. These men didn't fight. Gannon and Duarte developed a theory, a dark theory that would eventually make them pariahs in the law enforcement community and heroes to the families desperate for answers. The victims were being drugged, substances that wouldn't show up on standard toxicology screens. Gamma hydroxybutyrate, known as GHB, ketamine, rohypnol, drugs that leave the system within hours, long before a body's recovered from cold water. Once incapacitated, the victims were abducted, taken to an unknown location, held somewhere for days, sometimes weeks. During that time, security footage would show nothing. Credit cards would go unused. Cell phones would go dark. The victims would simply vanish. Then their bodies were placed in the water to stage an accidental drowning. The cold water would wash away evidence. The natural decomposition would obscure the timeline. And the official story would write itself. Another drunk college kid, another tragic accident, another case closed. Detective Duarte would later explain that the toxicology screens only test for common substances: alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, standard recreational drugs. But there are dozens of substances that leave the system within hours, drugs specifically designed to be undetectable. If you don't test for them immediately, and I mean within hours of death, they're gone, vanished, like they were never there. The detectives believed they were looking at something unprecedented in American criminal history, a coordinated network of killers operating across multiple states for over 2 decades, hunting successful young men and making their murders look like accidents. Think about the level of sophistication that would require: the planning, the coordination, the discipline, the knowledge of forensic science needed to stage a perfect drowning, the understanding of toxicology to use drugs that disappear, the patience to hold victims for days or weeks before disposal. But if Gannon and Duarte were right, they'd need proof, real evidence, not just patterns and coincidences. In 2008, they thought they'd found it. The smiley face wasn't just graffiti. It wasn't random urban art sprayed by bored teenagers. Gannon and Duarte believed it was a signature, a calling card left by the killers to mark their territory, to communicate, to boast. Different colors, different sizes, different styles. Some were crude, done quickly with a single can of spray paint. Others were elaborate, with additional markings and symbols. Betty Boop figures drawn next to some of the smiley faces. Devil horns added to others, phrases in German, numbers beneath the smiles. Detective Gannon would say that's what convinced them this wasn't one person. This was a group, a network, multiple killers working in coordination, communicating through these symbols. Each smiley face might represent a different member's work. The variations might be signatures within the signature. Some of the graffiti had numbers beneath the smiley faces. Dates, possibly, or victim counts. The detectives documented every symbol, every variation, every additional marking. They photographed them, mapped them, analyzed the paint types and application methods. They believed these were codes, messages between members of the killing network. A visual language that only they could understand. Territory markers that said, "This is our hunting ground. We've killed here. This victim was ours." In 2008, Gannon and Duarte took their findings to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 45 linked cases, detailed timelines showing the patterns, geographical mapping demonstrating the clusters, the symbol evidence documented and photographed, victim profiles showing the shocking similarities. They called it the smiley face murder theory. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's response: they found no evidence to support a link between these deaths or the theory of a coordinated serial killer network. No evidence, despite the patterns, despite the symbols, despite the victim profiles, despite the geographical clusters, despite the timeline consistencies. The FBI concluded that Gannon and Duarte were seeing connections that didn't exist, that they were victims of confirmation bias, finding patterns in random data because they wanted to find patterns. These were accidental drownings, nothing more. Tragic, yes. Suspicious, no. But the families weren't convinced, and neither were Gannon and Duarte. Todd Geeb's father would say his son was 6 feet 4 inches tall, 230 pounds, a Division I athlete, and they wanted him to believe Todd got intoxicated, wandered 2 miles in the opposite direction of his home, jumped a locked fence, and accidentally fell into a lake? No. Something happened to his boy, something the police weren't investigating. The question that emerged from this clash between the detectives and the FBI is the same question that has haunted these investigations for 25 years. Were these young men victims of their own choices? Bad decisions made under the influence of alcohol on cold nights near dangerous water? Or were they targeted by predators who learned to kill without leaving a trace? The pattern exists. It's documented. The evidence is photographed. The families are still searching for answers. But here's what nobody expected. When Gannon and Duarte dug deeper into the methodology, into how these killings could have been executed without leaving forensic evidence, what they uncovered was more sophisticated, more terrifying, and more plausible than anyone imagined. If the smiley face killers are real, they're not just murderers. They're criminal masterminds who've perfected the art of invisible killing. And their method is disturbingly simple. Let's reconstruct how this could work, how you could kill dozens of people over 2 decades without leaving enough evidence for a single murder conviction. Step 1. Target selection. The victims aren't random. They fit a specific profile. College athletes, social, outgoing, likely to be drinking heavily on weekends. These are young men who feel invincible, who take risks, who might accept a drink from a friendly stranger at a crowded bar, who might not notice if their beer tastes slightly off. Step 2. The approach. Detective Duarte believed the killers blend into the bar scene. They don't look threatening. They look like everyone else. College-aged or slightly older, dressed appropriately for the venue. Friendly. Approachable. They strike up conversations about sports or school. They wait for the victim to be separated from friends. Just for a moment, that's all they need. Step 3. Incapacitation. A drug drink, something fast-acting that mimics alcohol intoxication. The victim becomes disoriented within minutes, compliant, suggestible, unable to resist or call for help. To anyone watching, he just looks drunk. Nothing unusual for a weekend night at a college bar. Step 4. The abduction. Here's what makes this theory so disturbing. Most of these men disappeared from busy downtown areas. Security cameras on every corner. Witnesses everywhere. Heavy foot traffic. Yet not one person reported seeing a struggle or an abduction. Not one witness came forward to say they saw something suspicious. Criminal psychologist Dr. Morris Godwin explained that if you incapacitate someone properly, they appear intoxicated, stumbling, compliant, quiet. Two people helping an apparently drunk friend to a car? Nobody looks twice. It's something you see every weekend night in every college town in America. It's the perfect cover. It's invisible. Step 5. The holding period. Remember Christopher Jenkins? Missing for 4 months, but the medical examiner determined he'd been deceased for less than 2 weeks. Where was his body for 106 days? The detectives believe the victims are held somewhere. A basement, a storage unit, an abandoned building, somewhere isolated where screams wouldn't be heard, somewhere climate-controlled to preserve the body in a specific state. Detective Gannon would say they don't know what happens during that time. The bodies show drowning as cause of death, but they don't show what happened in the days or weeks before the drowning occurred. The forensic evidence can't tell that story. The bodies can't speak. Step 6. The disposal. The bodies are placed in water during winter months when rivers are freezing. The cold water preserves the body but also corrupts the forensic timeline. It makes it impossible to determine exact time of death. It washes away trace evidence, fibers, DNA, anything that might lead back to a suspect or a location. And then, the smiley face, spray painted near the recovery site as a signature. A mark that says, "We were here. This was us. This was our work." It's a method that requires knowledge. Medical knowledge to understand which drugs to use. Forensic knowledge to understand how to stage a convincing drowning. Criminal knowledge to avoid security cameras and witnesses. Geographic knowledge to select disposal sites where currents and water temperature would aid in evidence destruction. And if Gannon and Duarte are right, it's worked perfectly for over 2 decades. Dozens of victims, 0 convictions, 0 arrests, 0 suspects even identified. But there was one case that nearly broke the pattern. One victim who might have survived long enough to leave behind a clue that couldn't be washed away by cold water. Dakota James, 23 years old, Pittsburgh, January 2017. Dakota disappeared after leaving a downtown bar on a Wednesday night. Not a weekend, not a typical party night, just a regular evening that ended in tragedy. His family immediately suspected foul play. Dakota's father would say that Dakota was street smart. He wouldn't have walked toward the river. It was in the opposite direction of his apartment. His phone's GPS tracking showed he knew exactly where he was. He'd walked that route home dozens of times. Dakota's body was found in the Ohio River 40 days later. Drowning, high blood alcohol content. The medical examiner prepared to rule it an accidental drowning. Another tragic case, another young life lost to poor decision-making and alcohol. But here's what made this case different. Dakota's phone, it was still in his pocket when his body was recovered, and it was still operational. The water damage hadn't completely destroyed it. Digital forensic specialists were able to pull the location data from the phone's internal memory. They reconstructed Dakota's movements on the night he disappeared, and what they found didn't match the official narrative at all. The night Dakota disappeared, His phone pinged off cell towers in a completely different direction from where his body was eventually found. For 3 hours after he was last seen alive by witnesses, the phone moved through areas Dakota had no reason to be. Industrial zones, neighborhoods he'd never visited, areas far from his usual routes. Then at approximately 4:30 in the morning, the phone went dark. No more pings, no more data, no more movement. 40 days later, his body surfaces miles away from where the phone last transmitted. And at the recovery site, a smiley face, freshly painted, bright yellow against dark concrete. Detective Gannon said the phone data is critical. It shows movement inconsistent with someone who drunkenly wandered into a river. It shows deliberate, linear movement. Someone or something was moving Dakota's phone away from the last place he was seen. The movement pattern doesn't match intoxicated wandering. It's too purposeful, too directed. The Pittsburgh police ruled it an accidental drowning, case closed, but the digital forensic expert who examined the phone data disagreed. The movement pattern doesn't match intoxicated wandering. It's too deliberate, too linear. And the phone going offline precisely when it does, at 4:30 in the morning? That's not an accident. That's intentional. Dakota's case gave the smiley face theory something it had never had before: digital evidence, proof that at least one victim's movements didn't match the accidental drowning narrative, proof that something else happened during the missing hours. But it still wasn't enough. Not enough to reopen investigations, not enough to change official rulings, not enough to convince the FBI they'd been wrong. Because in 2008, the FBI didn't just dismiss the theory, they actively worked to discredit it. And what the FBI said next would split the true crime community down the middle and turn the Smiley Face Killers into one of the most controversial cases in American history. June 2008, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit issues a public statement. The statement reads, "The FBI has reviewed approximately 20 cases attributed to the smiley face theory. We have found no evidence of homicide, no evidence of coordination, no evidence of a serial killer network." The statement continues, "The deaths are consistent with accidental drowning following alcohol consumption. The smiley face graffiti is common urban art with no evidential link to the deaths." Translation: Gannon and Duarte are wrong. They're seeing connections that don't exist. They're giving false hope to grieving families. They need to stop. But here's what makes this fascinating. The FBI didn't conduct new investigations. They didn't visit the recovery sites. They didn't interview the families. They didn't commission new autopsies or toxicology screenings. They reviewed existing case files. Files where local police had already ruled accidental death. Files that were created with the assumption that these were accidents. Detective Duarte would respond by saying, of course they found no evidence of homicide. They were looking at reports that were designed to close the cases as accidents. They didn't re-examine the bodies. They didn't investigate the graffiti timing. They didn't analyze the patterns. They just read reports written by investigators who'd already made up their minds. The FBI's dismissal created two camps, two completely opposed interpretations of the same evidence. Camp 1, the skeptics, forensic experts, statisticians, law enforcement officials, people who believe the pattern is coincidental. Young men drink heavily, they walk near water, they fall in, they drown. It happens hundreds of times per year across America. It's tragic, but it's not mysterious. It's not murder. Criminologist Dr. Michael Arntfield would argue that just because you can connect cases on a map doesn't mean they're connected by a killer. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing. If you're looking for a pattern, you'll find one, even in random data. The human brain is wired to see patterns. It's how we make sense of chaos. But sometimes chaos is just chaos. Camp 2, the believers, the families, independent investigators, the detectives who refuse to back down. People who look at the same evidence and see something sinister, something coordinated, something that can't be explained by coincidence alone. Detective Gannon would say he's worked homicides for 40 years. He knows the difference between coincidence and pattern. He knows what random looks like. And this isn't random. This is a pattern. A clear, documented, undeniable pattern. The debate reached peak intensity in 2009 when Gannon and Duarte appeared on national television. They presented their case to millions of viewers. They showed the maps, the victim photos, the smiley face graffiti, the timelines. The reaction was swift and divided. Online forums exploded with amateur investigators mapping additional cases. Some found victims that matched the profile that Gannon and Duarte had missed. Others debunked cases by finding alternative explanations. Some families finally felt heard, finally felt like someone was taking their concerns seriously, finally felt like their son's deaths might be investigated as something other than accidents. Others accused Gannon and Duarte of exploiting tragedy for attention, of giving false hope, of making a terrible situation worse by suggesting their sons were murdered when they'd simply made tragic mistakes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation reiterated their position. No evidence, no serial killers, just accidents. They urged the media to stop giving the theory attention. They urged families to accept the medical examiner's findings. They urged everyone to move on. But here's the question nobody could answer. If the FBI is right, if these are just accidents, how do you explain the symbols? Because graffiti analysis revealed something the FBI didn't address publicly, something that makes the coincidence explanation much harder to accept. Many of the smiley faces appeared after the bodies were found, but before the discovery was made public, before the news broke, before anyone except law enforcement knew there was a body in the water. A graffiti expert who examined the spray paint degradation would explain that they can date how old spray paint is by analyzing its chemical breakdown and exposure to elements. Some of these symbols were less than 48 hours old when police found them. If it's just random street art, if there's no connection to the murders, that's a remarkable coincidence. Smiley faces appearing in the exact location where a body would be recovered days later, appearing before the public knew to look there? Remarkable coincidence. Or something else. Something planned? Something intentional? The truth might lie somewhere nobody expected, in the mind of a killer who was already behind bars. 2012, 4 years after the FBI dismissed the smiley face theory. A convicted murderer in a Wisconsin state prison requests to speak with investigators. His name is being withheld for legal reasons, but his story is not. He tells a story about a group he was part of in the early 2000s. Young men, college-educated, middle-class backgrounds. Not the kind of people you'd suspect of being serial killers. They had jobs, families, normal lives. They called themselves the Brothers. Their bond wasn't fraternity or friendship. It was hunting, but not animals, people. An investigator who spoke with the prisoner, speaking with his voice disguised to protect his identity, would recount that the prisoner described a game. A test of skill and nerve. They would select targets, young men who reminded them of people who'd wronged them. Athletes, fraternity types. The popular kids they'd resented in high school and college. The ones who had everything. The ones who made them feel small. According to this prisoner, the group would spike drinks with ketamine or gamma-hydroxybutyrate. They'd wait for the victim to become disoriented. Then they'd offer help. "Hey man, you okay? You don't look so good. Let me help you get home." The victim, confused and unable to resist, would comply, would get in a vehicle willingly, would trust these seemingly friendly strangers. Then they'd be taken to a pre-selected location and held, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Kept alive but incapacitated, kept in a state where they couldn't escape or call for help. The prisoner claimed the victims were eventually drowned in bathtubs or inflatable pools, held under until they stopped struggling. Then the bodies were transported to rivers and staged to look like accidental drownings, placed in the water at night when nobody would see, positioned to drift toward areas where they'd likely be discovered. The smiley faces, territory markers. A way for members to know where others had scored. A visual language that let them communicate without words. Each member had a slightly different style, different colors, different additional markings, but always the same basic symbol. Investigators immediately tried to verify the confession. They asked for specifics, names of other members, dates of specific killings, locations where victims were held, details that only the real killer would know. The prisoner provided vague details. Some matched known cases. He described a victim in Minneapolis who fit Christopher Jenkins's description. He described holding locations in industrial areas near rivers. He described the drug protocols and disposal methods. But other details didn't match. He claimed responsibility for cases that happened when he was verifiably in another state. He got victim names wrong. He provided locations that didn't correspond to any known recovery sites. A prosecutor involved in evaluating the confession would say they wanted to believe him. They wanted a break in these cases. Families deserved answers. But without corroborating evidence, without a body or a victim he could definitively link himself to, they couldn't move forward. They couldn't bring charges based on a confession that couldn't be verified. The confession was deemed unreliable, possibly the fabrication of an inmate seeking attention, or seeking a transfer to a different facility, or seeking some psychological satisfaction from claiming involvement in notorious crimes. But Gannon and Duarte noticed something. Several details in the confession matched elements they'd never made public. Details they'd deliberately withheld from media coverage to test future tips and confessions. Detective Duarte would point out that the prisoner knew about holding locations. He knew about the time gaps between disappearance and disposal. He knew about the drug protocols and which substances to use. These weren't things widely reported in the news. These were investigative details that only someone truly involved would know. Was the prisoner telling the truth? Was he a member of the Brothers? Did this group really exist? Or was he a fantasist who'd followed the case closely enough to fake credibility? Someone who'd read between the lines of news reports and pieced together what the detective's theory must be? The confession was never verified. 6 months later, the prisoner recanted. He claimed he'd made it all up, said he was bored, said he wanted attention, said he'd read about the cases online and invented the story to seem important. But the damage, or the revelation, was done. The smiley face theory now had a potential confessor. Even if nobody could prove he was real, even if his confession ultimately meant nothing. As we move deeper into this investigation, we're left with dueling narratives. The FBI says these are accidents. Gannon and Duarte say they're murders. A prisoner confesses, then recants. Families demand answers while experts demand evidence. And the smiley faces keep appearing, because here's what nobody disputes. Young men are still disappearing from bars. They're still being found in rivers. And somebody is still spray painting symbols at the sites where the bodies surface. The question isn't whether this is happening. The question is why. Before we can determine if the smiley face killers are real, we need to confront the evidence that says they're not. And that evidence is more convincing than you might think. Let's talk about statistics. Because if Gannon and Duarte are wrong, the numbers should show it. And the numbers are striking. Dr. Jonathan Pincus, a statistician who studied drowning patterns, explains that in the United States, approximately 4,000 people drown annually. Roughly 40% of those drownings involve alcohol. Young men aged 18 to 25 are disproportionately represented because of risk-taking behavior and higher rates of binge drinking. Translation: young intoxicated men drowning is not unusual. It's tragically common. It happens every single day in America. In college towns near major waterways, these drownings spike during winter months. Why winter? A hydrologist who studies cold water immersion explains that cold water causes immediate shock to the human body. It triggers gasping, hyperventilation, and disorientation. An intoxicated person who falls into water below 50 degrees Fahrenheit has less than 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in. They can't swim effectively. They can't call for help. Their muscles seize. They sink. The skeptics argue that Gannon and Duarte have identified a cluster that only seems unusual because they're actively looking for a pattern. This is called confirmation bias. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Dr. Arntfield explains it this way. Confirmation bias is when you start with a conclusion and then find evidence to support it. If you map 40 drownings over 12 years across 11 states, you're going to find similarities. That doesn't mean they're connected. It means you've selected data that fits your pre-existing theory. The smiley face graffiti, critics say it's one of the most common forms of street art in America. A graffiti investigator points out that smiley faces are everywhere. On train cars, bathroom stalls, highway overpasses, alley walls. If you look near any urban waterway, you'll find them. They're simple to draw. They're universally recognized. They're popular among graffiti artists precisely because they're so basic. The fact that some smiley faces appear near drowning sites? That's not evidence of anything except the ubiquity of smiley face graffiti. If you look near where car accidents happened, you'd probably find smiley faces there too. It doesn't mean there's a car accident serial killer. But here's where the skeptics make their strongest point. If there's a coordinated network of killers spanning multiple states and operating for 25 years, where is the physical evidence? An FBI behavioral analyst who worked on reviewing the cases explains, serial killers leave evidence. DNA on clothing, fingerprints on belongings, witnesses who saw something suspicious, digital footprints from cell phone usage or financial transactions. We've investigated every known serial killer network in American history. They all slip up eventually. Someone talks, someone makes a mistake, someone leaves evidence behind. If the smiley face killers exist, they'd be the most sophisticated, disciplined, invisible killers ever documented. That's not impossible, but it's statistically improbable. It would require a level of operational security that even trained intelligence operatives struggle to maintain. Statistically improbable, not impossible, just unlikely. So where does that leave us? With two explanations for the same set of facts. Explanation 1. 45 young men made the same fatal mistake. They drank too much. They walked too close to dangerous water. They fell in. They drowned. The smiley faces are unrelated graffiti that happened to be near the recovery sites purely by coincidence. Explanation 2. A network of killers has been operating in plain sight for over 2 decades. They've been drugging victims, holding them in unknown locations, staging their deaths as drownings, and leaving symbols as signatures. They've done this dozens of times without ever leaving enough evidence for a single arrest. One explanation requires belief in tragic coincidence. The other requires belief in criminal genius. Which one do you choose? Which one makes more sense? Which one is more likely in the real world? The answer might depend on something more powerful than evidence. It might depend on what we need to believe about the world we live in. Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Why do we want the smiley face killers to be real? Criminal psychologist Dr. Scott Bond explains that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We're wired to find cause and effect even where none exists. It's a survival mechanism that evolved over millions of years. Our ancestors who saw patterns in nature, who noticed that certain mushrooms were poisonous or certain animals were dangerous, survived longer than those who didn't. But this same mechanism can lead us astray in the modern world. We see patterns that aren't there. We find connections in random data. Random danger is terrifying because it can't be predicted or prevented. But a serial killer? That's danger we can understand. Name, categorize, hunt. That's danger with a face and a motive. That's danger we can fight. The families of the victims face an impossible choice. Accept that their sons died because of their own decisions. Intoxication, recklessness, poor judgment, walking too close to water on a cold night, or believe their sons were victims of predators, innocent targets of evil people who chose them for reasons beyond their control. A grief counselor who works with families of drowning victims explains that grief demands meaning. He was murdered provides a clear villain, a sense of injustice that can be fought, a reason to stay angry and active and engaged. He drowned while intoxicated offers no villain except perhaps the victim himself. That's unbearable for a parent. No parent wants to believe their child's death was their own fault. This is why conspiracy theories thrive in cases of unexplained tragedy. They offer certainty in the face of chaos. They give us someone to blame. They transform random suffering into purposeful evil, and purposeful evil can be fought. Random tragedy cannot. The smiley face theory taps into deep cultural anxieties, the fear that evil is organized, that it's hidden among us, that predators are watching and waiting for opportunities. It echoes older moral panics, The satanic panic of the 1980s, when people believed organized satanic cults were abducting and murdering children across America. Fears of organized child abduction rings that turned out to be vastly exaggerated. Urban legends about gang members committing murders as initiation rites. All of these panics shared the same structure: a hidden network, operating in secret, targeting innocents, hiding in plain sight, never quite provable, but never quite disprovable either. Dr. Arntfield points out that these theories persist because they satisfy psychological needs. They make us feel vigilant instead of helpless. They turn random tragedy into a puzzle we can solve. They give us a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic and senseless. But here's the darker question. What if our need to believe in the conspiracy is blinding us to a simpler, preventable truth? What if the real killer isn't a gang of predators? What if it's our culture itself? What if it's alcohol culture? Binge drinking normalized on college campuses. Young people consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol and then walking home alone through unfamiliar areas in the middle of winter. What if it's toxic masculinity that tells young men they're invincible, that they don't need help, that asking for a ride home is a sign of weakness? A campus safety advocate who works on alcohol education makes this point. We lose hundreds of young people every year to alcohol-related drownings. If we spent half the energy investigating drinking culture that we spend chasing serial killer theories, we might actually save lives. We might prevent the next tragedy instead of just trying to explain the last one. The smiley face theory has sparked debates. It's generated investigations, media coverage, public awareness, online forums dedicated to mapping cases and analyzing evidence. But it hasn't changed the one fact that repeats year after year. Young men keep drinking heavily. They keep walking alone at night near dangerous water. They keep ending up in rivers. So maybe the question isn't whether the smiley face killers are real. Maybe the question is why we need them to be. What does it say about us that we'd rather believe in an invisible network of sophisticated serial killers than confront the mundane reality that alcohol kills people every single day? But the families who lost their sons don't have the luxury of philosophical debate. They don't get to theorize from a distance. They have to live with the grief every single day, and some of them are still searching for answers. Patrick McNeil's mother has spent 22 years fighting to have his death re-examined. Every parent wants to believe their child's death meant something, that it wasn't just random, senseless. She's been told repeatedly that the case is closed. Accidental drowning. Nothing more to investigate. But she says she doesn't know if Patrick was murdered. She just knows the police didn't try hard enough to find out. If there's even a chance, even 1%, that someone took her son, she needs to know. She needs them caught. She can't rest until she knows the truth. Across the country, dozens of families share her pain, share her uncertainty, share her desperate need for answers that may never come. Todd Gieb's father asks a simple question that nobody has adequately answered. The FBI says it's an accident. Fine. Then explain to me how my son's body traveled 15 miles upstream against the current. Explain how a 230-pound athlete drowned in 4 feet of water with no head injury, no sign of struggle, no evidence of what caused him to fall. Todd Gieb's family hired independent forensic experts to review the case. The experts confirmed the FBI's findings: drowning, alcohol involvement, no evidence of homicide. But they also noted inconsistencies. The current flow patterns didn't match the body's position. The timeline didn't quite add up. Could Todd have drowned accidentally? Yes. Is it the most likely explanation, given the physical evidence? The expert said he couldn't say that with certainty. This is the cruelty of ambiguity. The families live in a permanent state of not knowing, never getting closure, never getting final answers. A sister of one victim explains that the worst part isn't the grief. Grief is natural. Grief is expected when you lose someone you love. The worst part is the doubt. Every night she wonders, did he fall or was he pushed? Did he call for help? Was he scared in those final moments? Did he know what was happening to him? She'll never know. And that uncertainty is more painful than any definitive answer could be. In 2019, several families formed a coalition. They pooled resources. They hired private investigators to review the cases with fresh eyes. They pushed for official case reviews by law enforcement. They demanded new toxicology tests on preserved tissue samples that might reveal drugs that weren't tested for originally. Some cases were reopened. Police departments agreed to take another look. Medical examiners reviewed their original findings. But none of the cases have been reclassified as homicides. The official cause of death remains drowning in every single case. A private investigator who worked on several of these case reviews explains the fundamental problem: time. Most of these deaths happened 15, 20 years ago. Evidence has degraded. Witnesses' memories have faded. Security footage has been recorded over or deleted. Even if there was foul play, proving it now is nearly impossible. The window for solving these cases may have already closed. Nearly impossible, but not completely impossible. And that's what keeps the families going. The hope that one day someone will come forward. Someone who was there. Someone who knows something. One day new evidence will surface. New technology will allow testing that wasn't possible before. One day they'll have answers. Christopher Jenkins's mother says she doesn't need justice anymore. She's made peace with the fact that if her son was murdered, the killers may never be caught. She just needs truth. If Chris fell in that river while intoxicated, if it was truly an accident, she'll accept it. She'll find a way to live with that. But don't tell her that's what happened unless you're absolutely sure. Don't close the book on her son's life with a guess. Don't ask her to accept an explanation that has holes in it. These families have been called conspiracy theorists, grief blind, in denial about their children's choices, unable to accept the simple truth that their sons made tragic mistakes. But when you look them in the eye, when you hear them speak, you don't see delusion. You see parents who refuse to stop asking questions, parents who love their children enough to keep fighting even when everyone tells them to give up. And maybe that's not denial. Maybe that's love, the purest form of love, the kind that doesn't give up, the kind that demands answers even when answers seem impossible. As we approach the end of this investigation, there's one final question we need to answer. Not whether the Smiley Face Killers are real, but what we do with the possibility that they might be. 3 hours of investigation, 45 cases examined, hundreds of interviews conducted, mountains of evidence reviewed and analyzed, and we're back where we started. With a question mark. Here's what we know for certain. 45 young men are deceased. All were found in water. All had alcohol in their systems. All were ruled accidental drownings by medical examiners and coroners. Smiley face graffiti appeared near many, but not all, recovery sites. 2 retired detectives believe these deaths are connected by a serial killer network. The Federal Bureau of Investigation disagrees and maintains these are accidents. Here's what we don't know. Were the deaths truly accidental? Or were they staged to look accidental by sophisticated killers? Is the graffiti coincidental? Or is it a signature left by murderers marking their territory? Is the pattern real? Or is it confirmation bias leading investigators to see connections where none exist? The truth is, we may never have definitive answers. Not because the evidence doesn't exist somewhere, but because the evidence that could prove murder has the same appearance as evidence of accident. Drowning is drowning. Water in the lungs looks the same whether someone fell in drunk or was placed in the water unconscious. Dr. Wecht, the forensic pathologist, explains that's the genius of it if it is murder. Drowning leaves specific markers: water in the lungs, foam in the airways, specific tissue changes. These markers appear whether someone falls in intoxicated or is placed in water while unconscious or already deceased. Without witnesses or DNA evidence or some other corroborating proof, we're left with probabilities, not certainties. So let's examine those probabilities. What does the math actually say? A statistical analyst who reviewed the geographic and temporal distribution of these 45 deaths found something interesting. If they're random accidents, we'd expect a scattered pattern. Random distribution across space and time. What the data actually shows is clustering. Specific cities show multiple cases. Specific seasons show elevated numbers. Specific demographics are overrepresented. The probability of this occurring by pure chance? Less than 3%. Less than 3%. That means there's a 97% chance the pattern is not random, that something non-random is creating this cluster. But a non-random pattern doesn't prove murder. It could prove a non-random distribution of risk factors. College towns near water. Winter months when hypothermia risk peaks. A culture of binge drinking among young men. These factors aren't randomly distributed. They cluster in specific places at specific times. So of course the drownings cluster too. Dr. Arntfield makes this counterpoint. The 3% statistical anomaly sounds compelling until you account for selection bias. Gannon and Duarte selected these 45 cases from thousands of drownings because they fit the pattern. They deliberately chose cases that looked similar. If you cherry-pick data to match your theory, you can make any cluster look statistically significant. Cherry-pick data, or identify a pattern others missed, it depends on your perspective. Here's where we land after 3 hours of investigation. The evidence for organized serial killers is circumstantial. Patterns and symbols and coincidences, but no physical proof. No DNA, no witnesses, no confessions that can be verified. The evidence for accidental drowning is incomplete. It explains how the victims died, but not why they all fit the same profile. Not why the smiley faces keep appearing. Not why the timelines have those strange gaps. Neither side can prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. And that's where the smiley face killers will likely remain, in the space between proof and possibility, between evidence and theory, between what we can demonstrate and what we fear might be true. But there's one final revelation, something that happened just months ago that might change everything. April 2024. A 22-year-old college student disappears from a bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His name is being withheld pending the ongoing investigation. He was last seen leaving the bar alone at approximately 1:30 in the morning. 48 hours later, his body is found in Lake Michigan. Preliminary autopsy results: drowning, blood alcohol content, 0.21, well above the legal limit. The medical examiner prepares the paperwork to rule it an accidental drowning, another tragic case of a young person who drank too much and ended up in the water. But then a jogger finds something. Early morning, 3 days after the body's discovered, she's running along the lakefront when she notices fresh graffiti on a concrete retaining wall. Less than 50 yards from where the body surfaced. A smiley face, bright yellow paint, still wet to the touch. Crude circle, 2 dots for eyes, curved line for a smile. But this time, there's something different, something that's never appeared before in any of the other cases. Beneath the face, a date, spray painted in the same yellow color, the exact date the victim disappeared. Not the date the body was found, the date he vanished. A detective with Milwaukee Police Department, speaking carefully because the investigation is active, says they're treating this as an ongoing investigation. They're not ruling anything out. They're taking it seriously. For the first time in 15 years, police are not immediately calling it an accident. For the first time, the smiley face theory is being taken seriously by an active police department with resources to investigate properly. Detective Gannon, now in his 80s but still following these cases, says this could be it. This could be the case that breaks everything open. If they investigate this properly, if they test for the right drugs, if they check security footage comprehensively, if they take it seriously from the beginning, they might finally get proof. Proof that could vindicate 15 years of work. Proof that could give closure to 45 families. Or they might get another closed case. Another family told their son drank too much and drowned. Another smiley face dismissed as coincidence, or a copycat inspired by media coverage of the theory. As of today, December 2024, the Milwaukee case is still open. No arrests have been made. No definitive ruling has been issued. The investigation continues. Detectives are reviewing security footage, conducting interviews, waiting for complete toxicology results that will test for a broader range of substances than the standard screening. And that's where our story ends. Not with answers, not with closure, but with the same question we started with. Are the smiley face killers real? The honest answer? We don't know. We may never know. What we do know is this: 45 families are living with grief that may never find resolution. Two retired detectives have dedicated 15 years of their lives to a theory the Federal Bureau of Investigation rejects. Young men continue to disappear from bars and entertainment districts. Their bodies continue to turn up in rivers and lakes, and smiley faces continue to appear at the sites where bodies are found. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's confirmation bias. Maybe it's tragedy being exploited by investigators seeking one last case to solve before they retire. Maybe it's grieving families unable to accept painful truths about their children's choices. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the most successful serial killer network in American history. A network that's been operating for 25 years, that's claimed dozens of victims, that's never left enough evidence to be caught, that's hiding in plain sight behind a simple yellow smile. The next time you're in a city with a river, the next time you see a young man leaving a bar alone late at night, the next time you see a smiley face spray painted on a wall, you might ask yourself, is it just graffiti? Or is it a warning? Is it urban art? Or is it a signature? The Smiley Face Killers, real or imagined? Predators or phantoms? The answer's out there. Somewhere between the water and the wall, between the evidence and the theory, between what we can prove and what we fear. And until someone finds definitive proof, one way or the other, young men will keep disappearing. Families will keep searching for answers. Detectives will keep investigating. And the smiley faces will keep appearing, always watching, always grinning, always leaving us with one final question. What if they're real? If you have information about any of these cases, please contact your local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons. The Milwaukee case remains under active investigation. As of December 2024, no arrests have been made in connection with the smiley face theory. But the investigation continues. The search for truth continues. And somewhere, someone knows what really happened to these 45 young men. Someone knows if they drowned by accident or if they were murdered. Someone knows if the smiley faces mean something or if they're just random graffiti. That someone might be you. That someone might be watching this right now. That someone might finally be ready to come forward and tell the truth. Until that day, the Smiley Face Killers remain exactly what they've always been. A theory, a possibility, a question mark hanging over dozens of unsolved deaths, a mystery that refuses to die.